Alan, thank you very much. And can I start by thanking KPMG, a living wage employer, for hosting this speech about responsibility today. Today marks 2 weeks since we found out that Millie Dowler's phone had been hacked by the News of the World. Rebecca Brooks has been arrested. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner has resigned. Tomorrow we will have some of the most important Select Committee hearings in modern times. It feels that everything has changed. But the real risk remains that too little will really change. I want to talk today about how we ensure this is not a brief moment that people will look back on and wonder what was that all about. Instead, I want to ensure this is a moment which will bring about a far greater sense of responsibility in our country. In particular, a new era of responsibility among the most powerful people in Britain. The heroes of the last fortnight have been the Dowler family. In the last week, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, Rupert Murdoch have all met them, and so have I. It was incredibly moving to meet a family that has shown such dignity throughout this process. Theirs is a tragic story, not just of what happened to Millie, but the way their pain was made so much worse by the hacking of their phone, the failure of the police, and the intrusion of the press. The bravery of Bob and Sally, her parents, and Gemma, her sister, in being willing to come forward is humbling. And when we were discussing what the inquiry should look at, Gemma said to me, "Everything about us was in the open at the trial. Why don't you politicians just put everything out into the open?" She was right. We owe it to the Dowlers and all of the other victims of phone hacking to put everything into the open. The Prime Minister is out of the country, but has now agreed with me to extend the parliamentary session for at least 24 hours so the House of Commons meets on Wednesday. It is very important that when it does, we have a proper debate led by the Prime Minister on all of the issues rather than simply a statement by him. We must give MPs the chance to debate the issues arising from the Select Committee hearing on Tuesday and ensure the Prime Minister addresses the many unanswered questions he faces. Sir Paul Stephenson yesterday made an honourable decision and took responsibility. It is of great concern, however, that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was unable to discuss vital issues with the Prime Minister because of his employment of Andy Coulson. It is also striking that Sir Paul Stephenson has taken responsibility and resigned over the hiring of Mr. Coulson's deputy, when the Prime Minister hasn't even apologised for the hiring of Mr. Coulson. We need leadership to get to the truth of what happened. But the Prime Minister is hamstrung by the decisions he made and his refusal to face up to them. But it is also important for the country to do something more than simply to provide transparency and get everything into the open, as Gemma said to me. Every so often, an event like this happens, and we have to ask ourselves deeper questions. What does it say about our country? How did we let this happen? And how do we change to ensure it never happens again? And that's what I want to address today. A few weeks ago, I talked about a set of values which are the essence of Britain's character. Working hard, obeying the law, caring for others, knowing the difference between right and wrong, responsibility. These are the values which bind our nation together. I want my children to grow up in a country where those values are respected. But the hacking scandal has shown some of the awful consequences of the powerful in our country shirking their responsibilities. And it isn't the first example. Indeed, in the space of just a few years, we have now seen three great crises in British public life among those who wield massive power in this country. First, the banks, then MPs' expenses, and now our press. Superficially, each might look quite different in its causes, but there are common themes running through all three. The banker who paid himself millions of pounds for taking the most risky investments, which would land his company and the country in the mire. The MP who fiddled the expenses system, landing himself, his party, and our politics in disgrace. The editor of a newspaper which had a culture of illegality, not for the public interest, but simply in the search for sales, landing their paper and the whole industry in the dock. All are about the irresponsibility of the powerful, people who believed they were untouchable. And the issue of responsibility is one which must be tackled throughout British society, from top to bottom. The failure of our country to recognise and encourage responsibility isn't just bad for fairness or people's sense of right and wrong, it holds back our country. Let me start with what has happened in our media, because I said the Dowler family were entitled to an explanation of how we got here. The whole country, I think, wants to know how it was possible for an organisation which claimed to have great sympathy for the Dowler family to behave as they did. How could those responsible for phone hacking have lost all sense of right and wrong? And then all the other grotesque hypocrisy. The paper which displayed such sympathy for the 7/7 victims allegedly hacked their phones. The paper which claimed to stand for the military covenant then allegedly hacked the phones of the families of those who died serving our country. A company whose papers claimed to speak for the people of Britain displayed contempt for the people of Britain. As each of these revelations has emerged, I have thought long and hard about how this happened. Ultimately, it was about individuals who had forgotten their fundamental responsibility to others in our country and lost their fundamental sense of right and wrong. But it wasn't just the individuals who perpetrated these actions that were at fault. Because we also have to explain something else. Why was it so widespread, so systematic? And why wasn't it stopped? Why did News International engage in denial for so long? How could Rupert Murdoch say, only a couple of days ago, that they had handled these allegations extremely well, with only minor mistakes? I think the answer is simple. This was an organisation that thought it was beyond responsibility. Its power was so immense, its influence so great, from prime ministers downwards. Nobody confronted them, nobody held them to account, nobody seemed really willing to challenge them. Not the police, not most frontline politicians, not most of the press. An organisation whose newspapers demanded greater responsibility among the powerless in our society believed it was so powerful that it was beyond that self-same responsibility. And let's be frank about this. It was one of the great failures of our politics that this power went unchallenged for so long. Because for all that the reputation of politics has been damaged, who else can stand up to powerful interests? That is part of what politics is about. We cannot allow it to happen again. And we must also make sure we get to the bottom of the relationships between the press and police. Clearly, the resignation of Sir Paul Stephenson speaks to the scale of issues that need to be faced. There are questions about why the first police investigation failed and why it wasn't reopened. Whether the police were too close to those they should have been investigating. And there are wider issues that will need to be looked at about information flows between the press and police and the specific allegations that have been made about payments to the police. But I said earlier that the crisis in our media had something in common with what happened in both banking and politics, and I want to say something about that. Of course there are differences, not least that nobody responsible for the banking crisis appears likely to end up in prison. Yet that should not obscure the similarities. The banking crisis too was a story of vaulting power and of shameful failures of responsibility. It was the closed culture of recklessness and excess in the banks that completely disconnected them from the reality of people's lives. It allowed some executives to receive vast salaries and bonuses, which often did not reflect the contribution they made or the way they were putting the economy at risk. Powerful people who answered to nobody. And when they were in crisis, they turned to the rest of us. They were too big to fail, and all of us bailed them out. And now there are signs they've returned to business as usual, still getting the big bonuses, still not lending to the firms and entrepreneurs that will create the jobs we need. And what about my profession? Again, there are differences, but there are similarities too. We saw the same shirking of basic responsibility, a culture of entitlement in Parliament, where some MPs thought it normal to take as much as they could. They had lost touch with the people who sent them there. They abused the people's trust. They stole from the taxpayer, and that is why they went to jail. The expenses system which brought MPs low was seen by some of them as outside the law. The people who fiddled the system thought they were untouchable. Nobody would hold them to account. So, in the press, in finance, in politics, we have seen behaviour by the powerful displaying great irresponsibility. People who thought they were beyond the law and responsibility, people who let down our country. The irresponsibility of the powerful is particularly wrong, as I have said. But irresponsibility is not confined to the powerful. And irresponsibility, wherever it is found, is holding Britain back. It has undermined our press and politics, reducing public trust. It has undermined enterprise and business, making it harder to build support for the wealth creation we need. It has undermined our welfare system, making it harder to provide the security we all want when people lose a job or get old. Across the country, and we've seen it in the last couple of weeks, there is a yearning for a more decent, responsible country. It is not only the duty of those who with power, though, to exercise responsibility. It is the duty of all of us to exercise responsibility and ensure that the powerful do as well. We need to restore responsibility as the great British virtue, from the boardroom to the benefits office. So what are the solutions? How do we achieve the goal? If we are to restore responsibility as the cornerstone of our society, it must start with the most powerful. Because when those at the top behave in the way they have, it sends a message about what is and isn't acceptable throughout our society. What is a young person, just starting out in life, trying to do the right thing, supposed to think when he sees a politician fiddling the expenses system, a banker raking off millions without deserving it, a press baron abusing the trust of the British people, or when large corporations avoid paying their fair share of tax, or any chief executive pays himself or herself over the odds? It sends the message that anything goes, that right and wrong don't matter, that we can all be in it for ourselves as long as we can get away with it. Politicians must be willing to speak out on these issues without fear or favour, about the top to the bottom of our society. Secondly, we need the right rules. We need to reform the benefits system to encourage a sense of responsibility. We can't endorse a something-for-nothing society. But we also need rules at the top. For MPs, we have reformed the expenses system, but there is a long way to go before we earn back trust. In banking, we have further to go still. We have not properly tackled the bonus culture, and we need to do so. And in the press, we need the right rules in place so that we can have a free press, not regulated by politicians, but acting responsibly. That means, obviously, we need a proper system for what happens when things go wrong, and not just about the police investigation that is obviously important. When a newspaper makes a mistake, it should have to publish a prominent apology, not bury it away on an inside page. When a newspaper wrongs someone, it should have to pay compensation and not force them to go to the courts. And the ethics of newspapers should be judged not by their fellow editors, but by independent people. Third, we all know it is large concentrations of power that lead to the abuse of responsibility. Markets work in the public interest when there is proper competition and excessive power is not held in the hands of just a few. The banks were too big to fail and neglected their interests of their customers. That is why we must ensure that when the reform of our banking system is completed, it is on the basis of a genuinely competitive banking market and doesn't leave just a few big institutions in place. And the same is true in our media. Before the closure of the News of the World, News Corporation controlled nearly 40% of the newspaper market. It also owns 39% of Sky B, giving it huge power, including effective control over 2/3 of the pay TV market. Politicians should have confronted this earlier, as I said. And let's be honest about the reason we didn't. It was in part because News Corporation was so powerful. I do not think that is healthy. It is not healthy for a country that believes in responsibility all the way to the top of society. It is not healthy for our democracy, where we see too much power in too few hands. It is not healthy for consumers. That is why Labour will be submitting proposals to the judicial inquiry for new cross-media ownership laws. And I urge David Cameron and Nick Clegg to join with us in pressing for the change we need. We should all find the courage also to challenge other areas where concentrations of power damage our country. Let me give you an example. 6 energy companies control 99.9% of the consumer market. That cannot be right, and we must take action to open up the market over the coming months. To ensure a more responsible country, we need a culture which demands it, rules which enforce it, and to break up concentrations of power which undermine it. When I think about the kind of country I want my kids to grow up in, I think about a country where people look out for each other, look after each other, care for each other. Every big challenge Britain faces requires this sense of responsibility to each other. We need greater responsibility at the top, so there is not simply greater and greater inequality in our country. We need to show greater responsibility to the next generation in Britain so they can do better than the last, so that a decent education, access to housing, or the chance of a good job does not become the preserve just of a privileged few. And we all need to show responsibility if we are to build strong communities with mutual trust and respect. The resolve to address irresponsibility, including among the most powerful, reflects the common sense of the British people, the common ground on which the vast majority of people stand. Now, there was a time when criticising people at the top was said to be anti-aspirational. But now, when irresponsibility at the top is holding Britain back and corroding our culture, it is our duty to speak out. Anything else would frankly be anti-aspirational. The task for all politicians is to speak directly to the concerns and common decency of the British people. We have been, for too long, too reluctant to look the powerful in the eye and say they must change, without fear and without favour. That's what's been different about the last fortnight. The old games played out between the powerful to the exclusion of everyone else must stop. But the danger is that this whirlwind blows through our country and then we go back to business as usual. I am determined we do not let this happen. We must make the lasting change that is necessary for the sake of the Dowlers and all the victims of phone hacking. To insist that everyone must show responsibility, including the most powerful people in our country. That everyone must play their part. That is the only way that we can do the right things for the victims of this crisis and build the responsible society that Britain now demands. Thank you very much.